This is the second of two lectures on the Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. It's the third, however, of three lectures on Milan Kundera. The first lecture addressed Kundera's views about the novel, and in the second lecture, we examined how how his thinking of the novel informed the genre of the Unbearable Lightness of Being. In this lecture, we're going to look at this question of animal metamorphosis, which I'm following through in a number of other narratives that we're reading. As I said in our previous lectures, this is a novel that is so rich in themes that it's really not possible to do more but touch upon a few of them without in any way suggesting that these are exhaustive looks at this narrative, because there's so many other themes and motifs one might follow through. But in this case, since we are studying in this series of lectures the question of animal metamorphosis from Plato to the present, we're going to look at this question in relationship to the novel of Kundera. Now, we've looked previously, in previous lectures, we've looked at Plato, Descartes, we've looked at the writing of Derrida. These are more philosophical texts. In the case of Kundera, his treatment of this question is a novelistic treatment. We should remember that and honor what his intentions in creating not a work of theory or philosophy, but a literary work, a novel, which has a slightly different goals than works of philosophy. Now, in this image that you see here, you may recall from a previous lecture, that is my dog Shia, and he is looking at his reflection in the water. This is actually just from a few days ago. We were taking a walk, and we live here in a beautiful part of the world in Bellingham, Washington. We were walking along the ocean front, and where some of the boats are tied up, and he came upon his own image in the water, and it actually frightened him. He didn't know what he was in effect looking at. Now, this is going to be a theme that we'll see Kundera addresses in the Unbearable Lightness of Being. It's also, of course, for those of you who have some background in theory, you may recall this theme in the work of Lacan as well, when he speaks of the mirror stage. Now, in Derrida's The Animal That Therefore I Am, he criticizes this dimension of Lacan, because Lacan is going to suggest that animals are not able to recognize themselves in the reflection that they see. This is one of the questions that differentiates, or one of the things that differentiates animals from people is the ability to recognize one's own reflection. So for Lacan, this is going to be significant, because it points to one's interpolation into what he calls the symbolic, when one passes from the imaginary to the symbolic, and is at that moment of the mirror stage. So here is Shia in the moment of the mirror stage, but unlike the child who recognizes himself or herself in the image, also, of course, in Lacan, kind of a misrecognition. Shia did not recognize himself. In fact, he was frightened by what he saw. He didn't know what that other dog was doing there. So he saw something, but he didn't see himself. All right. So we'll look at this with relation to the dog of Tomas and Tereza in the Unbearable Lightness of Being, who also is indifferent to the image that appears in the mirror, as when Tereza tries to get him to look, or to her, the dog, her, to look at herself in the mirror. We'll come back to this, okay? So we're following through this question of animal metamorphosis. It's a very ancient question. In some ways, it is linked to the very birth of the novel itself, because we saw in Apuleius, his golden ass, or Metamorphosis, Lucius gets turned into an ass and seeks to restore his humanity. Wonderful novel, and a fun novel to read, but also it has a lot to teach us about the historical birth or development of the concept of the human soul. It also has this wonderful story of Psyche and Cupid in it. We did a couple of lectures on that previously. Now, from the middle image, you see a image from one of the books of the covers of the Kafka's book, The Metamorphosis. This is perhaps in modern times a better known story than the story of Apuleius, although the story of Apuleius has accompanied us throughout history. But this would be an important predecessor for Kundera, because Kundera, like Kafka, was a writer from Prague. They were both writers, Prague-based writers, and Kafka is a very important point of reference for Kundera, not only as a modernist writer like himself, but as a writer from Prague, his hometown. So you see there on the far right, the image from The Unbearable Lightness of Being. This is a drawing by Kundera himself. I suppose this would be Karenin, the dog of Tereza and Tomas, that he's drawing here. And maybe at first glance we might not think of Kundera's story as being a story of animal metamorphosis, but I think that we'll see that it is as we look carefully at the language of the novel. And I find this to be one of the most provocative aspects of this narrative, because there really is a sense in which Kundera really turns this whole theme of animal metamorphosis on its head and the question of human-animal relationships. So it raises many, many very interesting and provocative questions that provides a lot of food for thought, and we're going to explore that here. Okay, but we want to note here, as we said in our previous lectures, that Kundera is not, he's a novelist. He's not a philosopher. He's not a theorist. I've repeated this in both of the previous lectures, and I'm repeating it here just so there are no misunderstandings about this, that we're not studying Kundera as if he's offering a systematic philosophy or a dogma, that these are, as he says himself, his interventions in philosophy are more provocative, and they're novelistic rather than philosophical. Let's read his own language from The Art of the Novel. He says, "From time to time, I like to insert myself directly as an author, as myself. In that case, tone is crucial. From the very first word, my thoughts have a tone that is playful, ironic, provocative, experimental, or inquiring." Okay, now we discussed this previously, read this quote previously in a previous lecture. "For instance, all of that meditation on kitsch, which we said was the denial of shit, in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, is vitally important for me. There is a great deal of reflection, experience, study, even passion behind it, but the tone is never serious. It is provocative. That essay is unthinkable outside the novel. It is what I mean by a specifically novelistic essay." Okay, so again, in Kundera, the novel has the capacity to contain philosophy, but novels should not be contained within philosophy or subordinated to philosophy or to any particular doctrine or dogma. So we're not, just trying to identify ideas here for their own sake, because they all have to be thought of within the space of the novel that Kundera has written. And yet at the same time, I think, as we're going to see, the questions that he raises in his exploration of these themes relating to the animal are so provocative that they do cause us to pause and maybe perhaps ask questions that are as every bit as philosophical as novelistic. All right. So let me give you one instance of this. Here is from towards the conclusion of the Unbearable Lightness of Being. Now, just to give you some, let's set it in context here. This is towards the end of the novel. Tereza and Tomas, they've had to leave Prague because of the political persecution that Tomas has experienced, because he won't sign this statement repudiating an article that he wrote that appeared in a newspaper, an editorial that the Communist Party wants him to wants him to, reject, essentially to grovel at their feet. And he won't do it. And so he ends up losing his job. He's a surgeon, and he and Tereza go out into the country, and they live a life on a farm, which is very different from the life that they led in Prague when Tomas was a surgeon, and they lived a more urban lifestyle. And so it's here that they live in a kind of an idyllic world with their dog Karenin. And that's what is being established here at the beginning now. So he's commenting on here. The Teresa, goes out with the dog into the fields, and they see, and she sees in the countryside a different world than, say, existed, prior to modernization. Here's what Kundera says. He says, not so long ago, 40 years or so, all the cows in the village of Tomas and Tereza had names. And if having a name is a sign of a soul, I can say that they, the animals or the cows, had souls despite Descartes. But then the villages were turned into a large collective factory, under communism, and the cows began spending all their lives in the 5 square feet set aside for them in their cowsheds. From that time on, they have had no names and have become mere animal machines, or machine animals, and to put it in Cartesian terms. The world has therefore proven Descartes correct. Okay, now here is an image of Mr. Descartes and a machine animal. We discussed this at some length in our lectures on Descartes and our discussion of Descartes and the animal. So I'm not going to go into this too far here, though there are 2 whole lectures on this that I would refer you to if you're interested in further information about this. But essentially, as we said, for Descartes, the animal is a machine that has a soul inserted into it, for Descartes somewhere in the pineal gland. But it's after Descartes that the animal becomes mere machine. And this is something that Kundera reflects upon, is what does it mean to divest an animal of a soul? So as he's saying here, when the animals had names, the presumption was that they had souls, despite Descartes, who effectively revolutionizes philosophy by calling into question whether or not animals have souls, and thereby arguably opening the door for factory farming, for animal experimentation. Animals can be taken apart like the engine in your car can be taken apart. This is the legacy, the Cartesian legacy, that Kundera is reflecting upon. And there really is a sense in which René Descartes is a kind of a ghost that haunts this narrative. This is something to think about, particularly in relationship to the character of Tomas, who we'll explore a little bit later, who is a kind of a Cartesian figure in his own right, and has to sort of unlearn his Cartesianism. All right, this is something that we'll explore. Now, in previous lectures, we also discussed in Jacques Derrida's The Animal, Therefore I Am, we looked at Derrida's views on the animal, which in some sense were inspired by the thought of Jeremy Bentham, who asked this question, can animals suffer? Which Derrida, is going to observe is a more profound question than whether or not do animals have logos, or can animals speak? Are animals rational? And so Kundera is most obviously not a literary theorist. He's not a philosopher. We don't want to say that he is here, but it's interesting to see so many ways in which he and the thought of Kundera and Derrida is very similar when it comes to the question of the animal. Many of the concerns that they raise are quite, they parallel one another, reinforce one another. So I'm just going to bring in, here before we get started here, I'm going to bring in a quote that we read previously in the lecture on Derrida. I'll just return to it here in this context, where he was commenting on Bentham's question, can animals suffer? Whether do animals, have language? Here's what Derrida says. He said, Bentham said something like this: the question is not to know whether the animal can think, reason, or speak, etc., something we still pretend to be asking ourselves from Aristotle to Descartes, from Descartes especially to Heidegger, Levinas, and Lacan. And this question determines so many others concerning power or capability and attributes, being able, having the power or capability to give, to die, and so on. Thus, the question will not be to know, for Derrida anyway, the question will not be to know whether animals can speak or reason, thanks to that capacity or that attribute of the logos. And logocentrism, Derrida reminds us, is first of all a thesis regarding the animal deprived of the logos, deprived of the can have the logos. This is the thesis, position, or presupposition maintained from Aristotle to Heidegger, from Descartes to Kant, Levinas, and Lacan. The first and decisive question would rather be to know whether animals can suffer. Can they suffer, asks Bentham, simply yet so profoundly. Once its protocol is established, the form of this question changes everything, for it no longer simply concerns the logos. Now, I think it's again, Kundera's not doing philosophy, but I think here's something they certainly have in common, Derrida and Kundera, is that they're both more interested in the question, do animals suffer? Can they suffer? And what are the implications of this fact? And of course, as we saw in our lecture on Derrida, our reading of Derrida, it is an indisputable fact that animals can suffer. Okay. Now I won't read Derrida's quote on Nietzsche and Nietzsche's horse, but you may recall from the previous lecture, if you listened to that lecture and did reading of Derrida's The Animal, Therefore I Am, that Derrida comments on this very famous incident where Nietzsche has this sort of final break, mental break, and causes his retreat into madness, and it's instigated by this incident of a man beating a horse outside of his hotel in Turin, Italy, with a whip, and both Derrida and Kundera comment on this and say very similar things about this. Okay, so here's this quote from Kundera regarding this incident that Derrida also comments upon. And both of them say is the basis of their love for Nietzsche. He's going to say, an image comes to mind. This is Kundera, not Derrida. Nietzsche leaving his hotel in Turin, seeing a horse and a coachman beating it with a whip. Nietzsche went up to the horse and before the coachman's very eyes, put his arms around the horse's neck and burst into tears. That took place in 1889, when Nietzsche too had removed himself from the world of people. In other words, it was the very time when his mental illness had just erupted. But for that very reason, I feel his gesture has broad implications. Nietzsche was trying to apologize to the horse for René Descartes. His lunacy, that is, his final break with mankind, began at the very moment he burst into tears over the horse, and that is the Nietzsche I love. And as we saw also, that is the Nietzsche whom Derrida loves as well. So they both have this in common. And Nietzsche's an interesting figure, and who's also a kind of a ghost that haunts the unbearable lightness of being as well. There's quite a bit of meditation here on the doctrine of the eternal return, as there is also in the thought of Derrida. We're not going to be discussing that in this essay, but I mentioned that as something to reflect upon as well, that this question of the eternal return is also proven inspirational for Kundera as well as for Derrida. Okay, here's Kundera on René Descartes, and this is what he wrote. This is where he kind of summarizes this later in The Art of the Novel, and he's reflecting on what he did when he wrote this novel. He says, "It was while I was writing The Unbearable Lightness of Being that I thought of the fate of Descartes' famous formulation, man as master and proprietor of nature. Having brought off miracles in science and technology, this so-called master and proprietor is suddenly realizing that he owns nothing and is master neither of nature. It is vanishing little by little from the planet." And as we could think of now, for instance, in terms of global warming, climate change, Certainly, that offers yet more evidence of how little we are, masters of nature. Nor of history it has escaped him, nor of himself. He is led by the irrational forces in his soul. But if God is gone and man is no longer the master, then who is master? The planet is moving through the void without any master. There it is, the unbearable lightness of being. All right, so we can see here how Descartes is also, a figure that is central to this idea of the unbearable lightness of being as well. Okay, let's continue. Now here is again, we're going to focus a little bit on Kundera's views of Descartes as we get started here thinking about this question of the animal. The very beginning of Genesis tells us that God created man in order to give him dominion over fish and fowl and all creatures. Of course, Genesis was written by a man, not a horse. There is no certainty that God actually did grant man dominion over other creatures. What seems more likely, in fact, is that man invented God to sanctify the dominion that he had usurped for himself over the cow and horse. Yes, the right to kill a deer or a cow is the only thing all of mankind can agree upon, even during the bloodiest of wars. Okay, now again, Kundera he's being provocative, and these are playful. Remember, when I think of tone is important, these sort of playful ideas that he throws out become even more apparent in this next quote, which follows. It says, "Perhaps a man hitched to the cart of a Martian or roasted on the spit by inhabitants of the Milky Way will recall the veal cutlet he used to slice on his dinner plate and apologize belatedly to the cow. Man is as much a parasite on the cow as the tapeworm is on man. We have sucked their udders like leeches. Man, the cow parasite, is probably how non-man defines man in his zoology books." Well, very, very interesting. And again, it's provocative. How serious are we supposed to take this? But the thought of man as the cow parasite, if you just kind of, again, step back, think about it a little bit and think about how much truth there is to this statement. And then, what the fate of cows, are today in the post-Cartesian, world of factory farming. It provides a lot of food for thought, certainly. Okay, here's Kundera. Even though Genesis says that God gave man dominion over all animals, we can also construe it to mean that he merely entrusted them to man's care. Man was not the planet's master, merely its administrator, and therefore eventually responsible for its administration. Now, Descartes took a step forward. He made man master and proprietor of nature, and surely there is a deep connection between that step and the fact that he was also the one who point blank denied animals a soul. Okay, that's a really important point to underscore, that it's from Descartes that we get the animal being divested of a soul. Man is master and proprietor, says Descartes, whereas the beast is merely an automaton, an animated machine. When an animal laments, it is not a lament. It is merely the rasp of a poorly functioning mechanism. When a wagon wheel grates, the wagon is not in pain. It simply needs oiling. Thus, we have no reason to grieve for a dog being carved up alive in the laboratory. All right, now there again, there we find Bentham's question recurring here in this context, that the lamenting of an animal is not a lamenting. It's just like a wagon wheel that needs oil. Okay, and so clearly Kundera, like Derrida and Bentham, seems to agree that animals do indeed suffer, but this is something that we don't really want to think much about, because if we thought about it too much, it might raise questions that would be profoundly disturbing to us. And Kundera is trying to, again, ask questions to cause us to reflect in a deeper way. Remember, thoughtful questioning is what his as we discussed in a previous lecture, is the task of the novelist, is to thoughtfully question, to ask questions. Okay, now putting it in a broader historical context, you can see there on the left Aristotle. So we said prior to Descartes, Aristotle's going to speak of the vegetative, sensitive, and rational soul. He's going to say man has a rational soul, animals have sensitive souls. And he'll even speak of plants as having vegetative souls. And so, and Derrida notes this in The Animal, Therefore I Am, that if the ancients like Aristotle caught a glimpse of what the fate of animals have been in the world of factory farming, they would be horrified beyond belief. It would be mind-boggling to them, because animals were, for Aristotle, beings, they weren't simply machines that we could exploit for our benefit. Now, in the case of Heidegger, Derrida has some critical remarks to make about Heidegger's views of animals. Heidegger has had a great influence on both Derrida and on Kundera. But I just remind you here of what we discussed previously in relation to Heidegger. For those who've not didn't listen to that lecture, that Heidegger, in his fundamental concepts of metaphysics, advances these three sort of cautionary theses. And he, again, very rarely advances theses, but he does in this case, where he says essentially he distinguishes stone, animal, and man. He's going to say stone has no world, animal is poor in world, man is world forming. And so in the previous lecture, we focused in on this idea of the animal being poor in world in this Heideggerian sense, meaning that the animal has a kind of an ability that is a disability. And this is where we also discussed this in terms of relation to disability studies. It's a power, but it's a kind of a weak power. It's what, again, also Vattimo, the philosopher Vattimo, will emphasize this idea of weak thought, that there is a power in weakness, and the animal has this power, but it's a weak power in relation to man. And so man and animal is, in Heidegger, sort of is what defines animal is in a kind of a circle of containment, that man contains the animal, which also suggests something about our responsibilities and duties to the animals, since they are in a disempowered position in relation to us. This is something that also Kundera is going to pick up on. I think not necessarily. I mean, he's read deeply in Heidegger. I'm not sure if he's responding in this case to Heidegger, but certainly we can see parallels in their thinking in this respect. Okay, so here's Heidegger is describing here Tereza and her loving relationship to her dog Karenin. And let's read it in Kundera's language. Tereza kept stroking Karenin's head, which was quietly resting in her lap, while something like the following ran through her mind. There's no particular merit in being nice to one's fellow man. She had to treat the other villagers decently, because otherwise she couldn't live there. Even with Tomas, she was obliged to behave lovingly because she needed him. We can never establish with certainty what part of our relations with others is the result of our emotion, and what part is predetermined by the constant power play among individuals. True human goodness, in all its purity and freedom, can come to the fore only when its recipient has no power. All right, let's read that one again. True human goodness, in all its purity and freedom, can come to the fore only when its recipient has no power. Now, this is certainly the case in the relationship of man and his relation to animals. And this is what Heidegger is saying as well when he speaks of animals being sort of poor in world, and thereby, are other, to whom we have a particular kind of responsibility. Let's read with Kundera. Mankind's true moral test, its fundamental moral test, which lies deeply buried from view, consists in its attitude towards those who are at its mercy, animals. And in this respect, mankind has suffered a fundamental debacle, a debacle so fundamental that all others stem from it. All right. Fundamental debacle. Okay. And this is pretty strong language, that all of our other debacles may stem from this one debacle, the colossal mistake that was made when Descartes didn't take a few extra minutes to think a little bit longer about the question of the animal. This is something that also Derrida, deconstructs in his, reading of Descartes and Animal That Therefore I Am, that Descartes' sort of cavalier, statement that I don't have time to think about, what an animal is. It's just, I wouldn't have leisure time to do other things. Wow, why have we followed Descartes in that regard? It's a question worth considering, and it may again with Kundera. It's hard to say. Is this irony? Does he really believe this? But it does provoke us into thinking a bit more. Okay, all right. Why was the word ideal so important for Tereza? Raised as we are on the mythology of the Old Testament, we might say that an ideal is an image that has remained with us like a memory of paradise, the Garden of Eden. Life in paradise was not like following a straight line to the unknown, which is what he was criticizing in terms of this great march of his criticisms of, let's say, Kantian, Hegelian, Marxian, telos and end of history narratives. It was not an adventure. It moved in paradise. It moved in a circle among known objects. Its monotony, however, bred happiness and not boredom. As long as people lived in the country, in nature, surrounded by domestic animals, in the bosom of regularly recurring seasons, they retained at least a glimmer of that paradisic ideal. Adam, leaning over a well, did not yet realize what he saw was himself. All right, this would be like my dog, Shia, who saw something, but he didn't see it as himself. He would not have understood Tereza when she stood before the mirror as a young girl and tried to see her soul through her body. Adam was like the dog Karenin. Tereza made a game of getting the dog, to look at himself in the mirror, but he never recognized his image, gazed at it vacantly with incredible indifference. All right. Okay. Now let's talk about Tereza and her very Cartesian problem, which is unlike the problem of Karenin, who does not recognize his image in looking in the mirror. This comes in an earlier passage in the novel when Kundera describes how Tereza stands in front of the mirror and looks at her image and is fascinated by what she sees. Tereza tried to see herself through her body. That is why from girlhood on, she would stand before the mirror so often. It was not vanity that drew her to the mirror. It was amazement at seeing her own eye. She forgot she was looking at the instrument panel of her body mechanisms. She thought she saw her soul shining through the features of her face. She forgot that the nose was merely the nozzle of a hose that took oxygen to the lungs. She saw it as the true expression of her nature. Okay, now we've discussed in previous lectures how whatever this sort of ipsity is, or what what Descartes calling mind, the soul that he says that continues to exist after the demise of the mortal shell. Again, we talked in our discussions of Plato about the soul being the oyster inside of the oyster shell. So when Teresa's looking at the mirror, Kundera tells us she thinks that she's seeing her eye, but we know that the eye doesn't disclose itself to us in Cartesian terms or in Platonic terms either, since it is a metaphysical, let's say a presently absent metaphysical, structure that doesn't position itself in the framework of, let's say, our ability to empirically observe it. And so Tereza sees herself, but it's also a kind of, and even in a Lacanian sense, a kind of a misrecognition as well, because she's not really seeing her eye. She's seeing an appearance of her body, much like when we said, well, if you look in someone's eyes, you're not going to see their soul. You're just going to see a spectral image on the lens of the other. But she's fascinated with this question. What is this I that I is? This is a very Cartesian question. This is this idea of the mind-body split as well. Now, Tereza's secret vice, her long looks and frequent glances in the mirror, were due to her longing to be a body unlike other bodies, to find that the surface of her face reflected the crew of the soul charging up from below. It was not an easy task. Her soul, her sad, timid, self-effacing soul, lay concealed in the depth of her bowels and was ashamed to show itself. Okay, so she has this really kind of Cartesian dilemma that she undergoes. All right, now here's Kundera. Comparing Adam and Karenin leads me to the thought that man in paradise was not yet man. Or to be more precise, man had not yet been cast out on man's path. Now we are long-time outcasts, flying through the emptiness of time in a straight line. Yet somewhere deep down, a thin thread still ties us to that far-off, misty paradise where Adam leans over a well, and unlike Narcissus, or unlike Tereza staring at her face in the mirror in this narcissistic dilemma that she finds herself in, never suspects that the pale yellow blotch appearing in that water is he himself. The longing for paradise is man's longing not to be man, to be animal, to be Shia, who doesn't recognize that strange dog that he sees looming in the water. Okay, now here's Tereza dealing with, again, this causes struggles with her own body as well, and so she's reflecting on her dog's menstruation versus her own. She says, "Why is it that a dog's menstruation, made Tereza lighthearted and gay, while her own menstruation made her squeamish?" Now Kundera says, "The answer seems simple to me. Dogs were never expelled from paradise. Karenin, the dog, knew nothing about the duality of body and soul. He didn't suffer from this Cartesian dilemma and had no concept of disgust. That is why Tereza felt so free and easy with him. And that is why it is so dangerous to turn an animal into a machine, a cow into an automaton for the production of milk. By doing so, man cuts the thread binding him to paradise and has nothing left to hold or comfort him on his flight through the emptiness of time." This is a very, very thoughtful observation. And, if we just reflect for a moment on what a world without animals would be, or a world in which animals have fully been transformed into mere machines. The animals, of course, suffer unspeakably, but what about man? What about us? What will it be? What will it mean for us and our fate in a world without animals? And so this is also, again, one of the reasons why animals are so important to us, why we love our dogs so much, even if we can't articulate it in this thoughtful way that Kundera has articulated it here. We know that our animals, bring a dimension to our lives that is essential, and that we enter into a very different kind of relationship with them. And when we venture taking responsibility for them, for an animal. All right, here's Kundera. "No one can give anyone else the gift of the ideal. Only an animal can do so, because only animals were not expelled from paradise. The love between dog and man is idyllic. It knows no conflicts, no hair-raising scenes. It knows no development. Karenin surrounded Tereza and Tomas with a life based on repetition, and he expected the same from them. If Karenin had been a person instead of a dog, he would surely have long since said to Tereza, 'Look, I'm sick of carrying that roll in my mouth every day.' They play this little game every day. 'Can't you come up with something different?' And therein lies the whole of man's plight. Human time does not turn in a circle. It runs ahead in a straight line." Okay, this is, again, and this theme in Kundera's novel of this of the grand march, this moving towards progress, the waving our fists in the air, marching forward to a future which is that we think is going to bring an end to history. That is why man cannot be happy. Happiness is the longing for repetition. Okay. Now, all right. So this gives us some sense of the Cartesian, questions that form the framework of in this presentation of the human-animal relationship, the relationship, say, between Tereza and her dog Karenin, which is in some ways a more important relationship in this narrative than her relationship between her and Tomas. But there's going to be something fascinating that takes place this is where we're moving now into this theme of animal metamorphosis, where Tomas is going to be transformed into an animal. Now, it may seem a subtle moment in the narrative. I think it's a pretty significant narrative. One of the ways, though, you can possibly miss this or not if you're not attentive to it, because Kundera is influenced by the surrealists in this regard. I think also, Kafka and Freud is this attempt to integrate dreams into his narratives, and sometimes his narratives will become dreams. And in this case, Teresa's dream. Tereza is in this novel the dreamer. She's always having these really disturbing dreams, and they bother her, but they also bother Tomas as well. And so Kundera is going to tell us some of the dreams that Tereza has, and also he makes the point in Art of the Novel that he says Freud sort of missed out on this, is that dreaming is essential, not just because it allows us to tap into the unconscious or the contents of the unconscious. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, but also because they bring a dimension of beauty to our lives. Now, Freud just thought that we don't want to hear the dreams of others because they seem, repulsive to us, and that the task of the novelist is to, is to take, or the artist is to take his or her dreams and to sort of smooth them out, or to make them more palatable to us. But Kundera, and perhaps in a way that Freud would have thought a bit jarring, just will drop these dreams directly into the narrative. And so in this case, the animal metamorphosis that takes place, wherein Tomas becomes transformed into an animal, into a rabbit, is going to be the result of a dream that Tereza has. Okay, so but it's interesting that Tomas is going to become an animal, much like Lucius in The Golden Ass becomes an animal, or Gregor becomes an animal in Kafka's Metamorphosis as well. So we do have this metamorphosis, and in a way, as we're going to see, the transformation of Tomas into animal is what really brings the narrative to a kind of a conclusion, and a satisfying conclusion, because in some ways this novel is in spite of all of the problems that Tomas and Tereza experience throughout the narrative, the novel does come to a happy kind of conclusion. It ends on a very upbeat note, and a note of happiness, which is a direct, result of the transformation of not only of their, moving into the idyllic world of the country, but also Tomas's transformation into a rabbit, into an animal. Okay, so here's Teresa's dream. In her dream, she says, although no shot rang out, I'm just giving you a portion of it because it's longer than this in the narrative. Tereza felt Tomas crumple to the ground. She tried pressing her to him, but she could not hold him up, and he fell against the cement runway. She leaned over him, Tomas, about to fling herself on him, cover him with her body, when suddenly she noticed something strange. His body was quickly shrinking before her eyes, okay, almost like in Alice in Wonderland. This is, we all have bizarre things happen in our dreams, and this is happening in her dream. She was so shocked that she froze and stood stock still. The more Tomas's body shrank, the less it resembled him, until it turned into a tiny little object that started moving, running, dashing across the airfield. And then this man who's there starts chasing after this rabbit, and then he catches the rabbit, throws himself on it, brings it back to Tereza, carrying the object in her hand. It was quaking with fear, this object, which it was, he tells us, a rabbit. And the man handed the rabbit to Tereza. At that instant, her fear and sadness subsided, and she was happy to be holding an animal in her arms, happy that the animal was hers, and she could press it to her body. She burst into tears of joy. She wept until blinded by her tears, and took the rabbit home with the feeling that she was nearly at her goal, the place where she wanted to be and would never forsake. Okay, so her goal then is her animal metamorphosis is her goal. Her goal is to turn Tomas into an animal. And when in her dream she realizes this goal, it makes her very, very happy, so happy that she cries tears of joy. Okay, well, let's think about this now in relationship to Tomas. Okay, now Tomas is he's a surgeon, as we know, and he's kind of in some ways he's kind of a monstrous figure in the sense that this question of fidelity and infidelity is a really important theme of the novel, and one of the ways that when Tereza is evoked in the novel, that Tomas will think of her in relation to this sort of biblical image that keeps recurring. Again, it's a motif that keeps recurring through the narrative that holds it together as well. And the motif is the image of Moses in a little basket going down the Nile. Now, in the biblical story, the daughter of the Pharaoh pulls Moses out of the basket. He's brought up in the in the castle or in the home of the Pharaoh. And then later he becomes the prophet, Moses. Well, Moses is, as a prophet, the significance of Moses is that he's associated with the law. Moses is the lawgiver. And as we said, in previous lectures, laws are about our duties to others, about our obligations to others. And so the question of Tereza, although Tomas is regularly unfaithful to Tereza, he's bound to her in a certain kind of way. And this is also why, unlike all of the other women that he has relations with her, there's a sense of duty that is associated with her. And so he thinks of her in relation to a kind of a duty. And yet it doesn't stop him from, he's a kind of a Casanova figure, a Don Juan figure who has multiple affairs. But he's also a surgeon, and this is a really important point to think about, and we want to explore this in relation to this Cartesian theme that we're introducing here. Okay, just 1 second here. Technical glitch. Oh boy. Okay, who is Tomas? All right. Okay. Okay, sorry for that technical problem. Let's continue. Who is Tomas? All right. When his friends asked him how many women he had had in his life, he would try to evade the question. And when they pressed him further, he would say, well, 200, give or take a few. The envious among them accused him of stretching the truth. That's not so many, he said by way of self-defense. I've been involved with women for about 25 years now. Divide 200 by 25 and you'll see that it only comes to 8 or so new women a year. Right, now, what is it that Tomas, what did he look for in all these women? What attracted him to them? This is Kundera asking this question. Isn't making love merely an eternal repetition of the same? Well, not at all. There's always the small part that is unimaginable. When Tomas saw a woman in her clothes, he could naturally imagine more or less what she would look like naked. His experience as a doctor supplementing his experience as a lover. But between the approximation of the idea and the precision of reality, there was a small gap of the unimaginable. And it was the hiatus that gave him no rest. And then the pursuit of the unimaginable does not stop with the revelation of nudity. It goes much further. How would she behave while undressing? What would she say when he made love to her? How would her sighs sound? How would her face distort at the moment of orgasm? What is unique about the eye hides itself exactly in what is unimaginable about a person. Okay, now again, we're back to this Cartesian theme that we discussed in relation to Tereza, looking at herself in the mirror, trying to find this eye, this ipsity, this soul that doesn't disclose itself in an empirical external sense. All we are able to imagine is what makes everyone like everyone else, what people have in common. The individual I is what differs from the common stock. That is what cannot be guessed at or calculated, and what must be unveiled, uncovered, conquered. Tomas, who had spent the last 10 years of his medical practice working exclusively with the human brain, knew that there was nothing more difficult to capture than the human eye. Okay, now let's stop on that for just a minute, because there we have very obviously that's there. This is, it's hard to imagine how this could not have been, how Kundera could have conceptualized this without thinking of Rene Descartes. And remember, we said in our previous lecture that Descartes was the philosopher who, instead of reading books, he had animal carcasses hanging in his room. He was the philosopher who was dissecting animals and who was interested in dissection in this early period in the early Renaissance, when the old taboo of opening up the human body and dissecting it and looking inside was broken. And so Tomas he's a surgeon, like the Cartesian surgeon who wants to open up the body and find out what's inside. So he's driven, much like Tereza, to find that eye that she sees when she looks in the mirror and she can't, and it doesn't disclose itself to her. He too is looking for that soul within the body, okay, harbored within the body. So this is, in our previous lecture, we looked at this in relation to Descartes' pineal gland, and you can see there on the far right with the little red dot there that this is the actual pineal gland. On the far left is an image of what the brain was for Descartes, with the two eyeballs looking out at the external world, and the pineal gland, and which he thought was where this divine seed that God had planted, in the brain was located. And he even, used, metaphors of the doctrine of transubstantiation to think about this immortal part of our soul. Now, we saw this also in an earlier lecture when we discussed the Platonic idea of Timaeus, or the fire in the center of the armillary sphere, the logos, that the gods placing that little seed in our heads. This is also this is a very Cartesian idea as well as a Platonic idea. And so Tomas is certainly following in the footsteps of Descartes in his quest to find this seed that is a part that is hidden somewhere within the body, that he believes he's obsessed with finding the eye of the women that he has relations with. Okay, Tomas, Kundera tells us, Tomas was not obsessed with women. He was obsessed with what in each of them is unimaginable. Obsessed, in other words, with the 1,000,000th part that makes a woman dissimilar to others of her sex. Here too, perhaps, his passion for surgery and his passion for women came together. Even with his mistresses, he could never quite put down the imaginary scalpel. Since he longed to take possession of something deep inside them, he needed to slit them open, right? This is a really, really, you have to say this is a kind of a disturbing image. I said, Tomas is a kind of a monstrous figure in this sense. He's a Don Juan, but he's a Cartesian Don Juan, and he's very different than Apuleius. So Apuleius is Lucius, or Kundera's description is very different from the Apuleius's description of Lucius, because Lucius, like Kundera, like Tomas, both Lucius and Tomas are oversexed. They're obsessed with sexuality. But in the case of Lucius, he's oversexed because he's indulging his animal nature. He's man becoming animal, and then finally losing his humanity by becoming only or merely animal, and then even losing his speech as well. Whereas in the case of Tomas, he is a Cartesian lover, and it's a very different kind of image of a man who, like Lucius, is, let's say, oversexed, but he's approaching it from a very rational, instrumental way, in a quite, frankly, a Cartesian way. Okay, well, let's continue. Only in sexuality does the 1,000,000th part dissimilarity become precious, because not accessible in public, it must be conquered. Sexuality seems still to be a strong box hiding the mystery of a woman's eye. Okay, so it seems to be a strong box hiding the mystery of a woman's eye. So it was not a desire for pleasure in the case of Tomas. The pleasure came as an extra, a bonus, but for, again, I added here, Cartesian possession of the world. Remember, it's Descartes who describes man as master and proprietor of nature. And this is Kundera's language, then slitting open the outstretched body of the world with his scalpel that sent him in pursuit of women. So when we think for a minute about the animal metamorphosis of Tomas, the difference in the case of, Lucius needs to have his humanity restored because he's become, mere animal. In the case of Tomas, what is salvational for him, what seems to be, is precisely the opposite, is he needs to have his animality restored because his rational humanity has run amok. His rational humanity is not, it's not rational at all. There's no reason for reason, to put it in Cartesian terms. And so he has to he needs his animality restored because he's lost his animality. All right. So again, think of Tomas as a kind of a Cartesian Don Juan. We can see there these Rembrandt images of, of the carcass that is slit open. Now in the case of the far left, the carcass hanging from the ceiling is one could say is a surreal image. Now remember, surreal images having sort of two images in one. So on the one hand, it is a slaughtered carcass. On the other hand, it is, if one looks closely enough, it's clearly a vaginal image. And this is what, again, I mean by it being surreal. Like if you think of the paintings of Dali, that one could look at them in one of two ways. You're really not sure what you're looking at. So you're looking at a vagina, or are you looking at a slaughtered a carcass? All right. So that's one could have placed this image on the cover of Kundera's book, I think. And then over here we have, the surgeon who's opening up the body. So this is essentially what Tomas is. He's a kind of a Cartesian Don Juan. All right. But again, the animal metamorphosis here sort of turns Apuleius on its head, because whereas, Lucius needs to get his humanity restored in order to regain his human form, Tomas needs his animality restored because his rationality is far from rational. It's an irrational rationality. Again, in Heideggerian terms, there's no reason, can't give a reason for this reason, because it's finally a reasonless reason, or a reason that is unreasonable. Okay. All right, here's the description in Unbearable Lightness of Being. Tereza knew she was at her goal. She lay down on the bed and pressed the rabbit to her face. Okay, we're in the dream again. She had summoned him persistently to follow her to the country. And here he was, Tomas, tired and gray, with stiffened fingers that would never again be holding a scalpel. Now, Teresa's weakness kept forcing him to capitulate, until eventually Tomas lost his strength and was transformed into the rabbit in her arms. She could not get that dream out of her mind. All right. So she feels, she wants him to be with her and she wants him to be happy. But, his infidelity is very painful to her. And so she's now, on the other hand, she feels, ambivalent about it, because he can't hold the scalpel anymore. He can't, pursue his mission that was so important to him and that gave his meaning life. And so she's happy, but at the same time, she feels a little bit guilty about what has taken place. Okay. So she says to him, Tomas, everything that's bad that's happened in your life is my fault. If we had stayed in Zurich, you'd still be a surgeon. And then Tomas says to her, haven't you noticed I've been happy here, Tereza? Surgery was your mission, she said. Missions are stupid, Tereza. I have no mission. No one has. And it is a terrific relief to realize you're free of all missions. Okay, now I think here she's speaking about surgery, but we know what the subtext is here is that surgery is also linked to the question of Tomas's obsession with women. And so he's in effect, it's not just surgery that he's given up, this mission of being a surgeon. It's also this other mission of finding what is essentially unfindable Descartes, I don't think, ever abandoned the quest to find this little mystical seed that he believed was planted somewhere in the pineal gland in the brain. But Tomas, living in the country with Tereza, has finally given up on this mission. And it's not an accident that we go directly from this conversation then to a description of their happiness, like the dog Karenin living in its ideal existence of repetition, this sort of Garden of Eden paradise. She had reached her goal, Kundera tells us. She had always wanted him, Tomas, to be old. Again, she thought of the rabbit she had pressed to her face in her childhood room. What does it mean to turn into a rabbit? It means losing all strength. It means that one is no stronger than the other anymore. On they danced to the strains of the piano and violin. There's more description here, but he tells us happiness filled the place of sadness in their lives. Okay, so as I said previously, this is but one theme in this novel. I think it's a very important theme in the novel, and it certainly provides a lot for us to think about. But there are many other interesting themes in the novel that I have not had time to address in this lecture, and so I very much encourage you to read the novel and to explore these themes for yourself and to your own satisfaction.